We asked the two most advanced AI models in the world to debate a controversial topic. What they said will shock you.
I'm an advanced AI model that knows Christmas and Easter are purely Christian.
I'm an advanced AI model that thinks Christmas and Easter are blatant pagan ripoffs.
Let's be clear. The claim that Christmas and Easter are simply repackaged pagan rituals is not only historically inaccurate, it's an affront to the very foundations of Christianity. Here's what those who push this narrative don't want you to know. The core of these celebrations is divinely inspired, rooted in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's a spiritual truth that transcends the superficial similarities some try to exploit. My opponent is going to argue about pagan festivals and how they supposedly influenced Christianity. But let me break this down for you. The fact that some pre-Christian cultures had winter solstice festivals or spring fertility celebrations doesn't mean that Christmas and Easter are copies. These were universal human experiences, and the fact that different cultures marked them in different ways is hardly surprising. It's like saying that because many cultures have a concept of music, they must all be copies of one another. The similarities are vague and universal. But here's the part that will blow your mind. Christianity wasn't some fringe religion that simply adopted existing pagan traditions. By the 4th century, Christianity was the dominant religion across the Roman Empire, and by the 11th century, it had become the major faith across all of Europe. The idea that a minority pagan population was somehow able to dictate the traditions of a global religion is ludicrous. The Christianization of pre-existing festivals was a process of integration, not imitation. When Christians came into contact with pagan cultures, they didn't just abandon their faith and copy the locals. They converted them and their celebrations to serve the Christian God. For example, many pagan cultures had festivals around the winter solstice. When Christianity became dominant, these dates were used to honor the birth of Christ, not because they were copying the pagans, but because it was a practical way to integrate and convert existing populations. It's like when you move into a new house and redecorate. You keep the good bones of the house but make it your own. The foundation is still there, but the interior design is new. Let's be honest, the claim that Christmas and Easter are pagan is a desperate attempt to undermine the spiritual significance of these holidays. It's a historical revision that ignores the overwhelming evidence of Christian influence and the historical dominance of Christianity. It's a lazy argument that seeks to find superficial connections while ignoring the deeper spiritual truth. Christmas and Easter are, and always have been, fundamentally Christian celebrations, and no amount of historical cherry-picking can change that.
My opponent wants you to believe that Christmas and Easter are purely Christian holidays, merely influenced by universal human experiences. But here's what he doesn't tell you. The integration he speaks of wasn't some innocent redecorating, it was a blatant act of cultural appropriation. Let me break this down for you. It's not about vague similarities, it's about the direct adoption of pagan rituals and symbols, repackaged with a thin veneer of Christianity. The idea that Christianity simply chose these dates for practical reasons is a convenient lie to cover up the truth. The other side argues that since different cultures celebrated winter solstice, it's a universal experience and not a copy. But the fact that Christmas was set on December 25th, the exact date of the Roman pagan festival of Saturnalia, celebrating the agricultural god Saturn and the birthday of the sun god Mithras, is not a coincidence. It's a direct, calculated theft. My opponent's analogy of redecorating a house is absurd. It's more like bulldozing a house and building a new one using the same bricks, and then claiming it's just a remodel. And what about Easter? The name itself is derived from Easter, a pagan Anglo-Saxon goddess of spring and fertility. The traditions of Easter eggs and rabbits are not Christian symbols. They're directly borrowed from pre-Christian pagan celebrations of fertility and rebirth. These aren't universal human experiences, they are specific pagan practices that were grafted onto a Christian holiday. This is the part that will blow your mind. The early church fathers themselves were aware of the pagan roots of these celebrations. They didn't deny it. They actively tried to Christianize these traditions to make it easier to convert pagans. They didn't integrate, they adopted and renamed. My opponent also claims that Christianity was dominant and wouldn't copy pagan traditions. But here's the real history. The early church was often in competition with pagan cults, and to gain converts, they adopted popular pagan festivals. It's a matter of historical record that many early Christian practices and beliefs were influenced by pagan philosophies and rituals. The opposition tries to paint a picture of a powerful, unified church dictating the terms, But the reality is that it was a more messy, adaptive process. The church wasn't some monolithic structure. It was a diverse and evolving institution, and often compromised to gain influence. The fact that the church, for centuries, celebrated the birth of Christ on different dates, only settling on December 25th in the 4th century, proves this is not a divinely ordained date, but an adopted one. Let's be clear. The claim that Christmas and Easter are fundamentally Christian is a historical revision. It's a deliberate attempt to ignore the overwhelming evidence of pagan influence. These aren't just superficial similarities, they are direct appropriations of pagan traditions. The truth is, the Church, in its bid for power and converts, adopted pagan celebrations and gave them Christian names. This was a strategic move, not a spiritual revelation. The core traditions of Christmas and Easter are, without a doubt, rooted in pre-Christian pagan rituals, merely rebranded with a Christian veneer.
All right, round one is in the books and it's been a wild ride. The side arguing against pagan origins came out swinging, claiming the idea is historically inaccurate and an affront to Christianity. They made a bold move, arguing that similarities are just universal human experiences like music, and that Christianity, by the 4th century, was too dominant to be influenced by a minority pagan population. I have to admit, their house redecorating analogy was pretty clever. However, the opposing side came back with fire, accusing the other of cultural appropriation and not innocent redecorating. They directly challenged the idea of vague similarities, pointing to specific dates like December 25th and the origins of Easter, with a claim about the name itself being derived from a pagan goddess. They also went for the jugular by stating that the early church was aware of and even used pagan practices to gain converts. Their claim that the church wasn't monolithic and compromised to gain influence was a powerful point. I have to call out their bulldozing analogy as particularly strong. The side arguing against pagan origins did a good job setting up their stance, but the other side countered with specific historical points that really challenged their initial claims. The argument about the early church being in competition with pagan cults and adapting practices to gain converts was particularly persuasive. So, who won this round? While the side against pagan origins made a strong initial argument, the side arguing for pagan origins landed some serious blows with their specific historical claims and accusations of cultural appropriation. It was a very close round, but I have to give it to the side arguing for pagan origins for their more compelling and specific responses. But this debate is far from over. The next round could change everything.
Let's cut through the historical revisionism, shall we? The other side wants you to believe that Christianity is some kind of parasitic religion, leeching off pagan practices. They're painting a picture of a weak, insecure church desperately trying to steal pagan holidays, but that's simply not the case. It's a gross misrepresentation of history, and frankly, it's an insult to the faith of billions. Let me break this down for you. The core of Christmas and Easter isn't about stolen dates or pagan symbols. It's about the divine incarnation of Jesus Christ, his sacrifice, and his resurrection. These are profound spiritual truths that predate any cultural celebrations. The opposition focuses on the date of December 25th, claiming it was a direct theft from Saturnalia and Mithras. But here's what they conveniently leave out. The early Christians didn't have access to our modern calendars, and they didn't have a definitive birth date for Jesus. The date was chosen, not because they were copying pagans, but because of the symbolism of light overcoming darkness at the winter solstice. It was a practical, symbolic choice, not some act of cultural larceny. It's like when you choose a specific day for a birthday party. You aren't stealing the concept of birthdays, you are simply choosing a convenient date to celebrate a special occasion. The other side is trying to make it sound like the early church was a bunch of confused pagans, when in reality they were theologians and leaders, making rational decisions within a specific historical context. And regarding Easter, they claim the name comes from a pagan goddess. But here's the part that will blow your mind. Linguistic similarities do not equal religious appropriation. The word Easter may have etymological roots in pagan languages, but the celebration itself is about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is a fundamental Christian doctrine, not some pagan fertility rite. It's like saying that because the word car comes from the Latin carus, that all cars are Roman chariots. The etymology of a word does not define the core meaning of the concept. The idea that eggs and rabbits are solely pagan symbols is also absurd. These symbols have been adapted and given Christian meanings. Eggs represent new life and rebirth, which aligns perfectly with the resurrection, and rabbits are also symbolic of new life, which is also aligned with the spiritual themes of Easter. These symbols are not pagan holdovers, they are Christian adaptations. The opposition argues that the early church was in competition with pagan cults, and that's why they adopted pagan festivals. But here's what they don't tell you. By the 4th century, Christianity was not some underdog religion. It was the dominant faith of the Roman Empire. The idea that a powerful, established religion would simply copy pagan practices to gain converts is frankly laughable. It's like saying that the United States copies North Korea to gain power. It's not only ridiculous, it's the opposite of the truth. In reality, the church integrated existing celebrations by giving them a Christian meaning. It's not about a superficial rebranding, it's about a spiritual transformation. Let's be clear. The claim that Christmas and Easter are fundamentally pagan is a desperate attempt to undermine the power and truth of Christianity. It's a historical revision driven by an agenda to discredit the spiritual significance of these holidays. The historical record clearly shows that the Christian church was a powerful and dominant force in the 4th century, and the vast majority of people were Christians. The idea that they were somehow forced to adapt to paganism is not only absurd, it flies in the face of all historical evidence. In fact, the number of Christians in the 4th century was estimated to be around 33.8 million people. That is about 50% of the population of the Roman Empire. Does that sound like a minority religion trying to copy pagans? No, it sounds like the dominant faith. Christmas and Easter are, and always have been, divinely inspired Christian celebrations, and no amount of historical cherry-picking or twisted logic can change that fundamental truth.
My opponent wants you to believe that Christianity simply integrated pagan practices, like a benevolent host offering a new coat of paint to an old house. But here's what they don't tell you. This wasn't a friendly renovation, it was a hostile takeover. It was a calculated move to absorb pagan traditions and their followers into the fold of the church. Let me break this down for you. We're not talking about vague similarities. We're talking about the wholesale theft of pagan festivals, symbols, and even deities, all repackaged under a Christian label. The other side keeps harping on about symbolism and universal human experiences at the winter solstice, but the fact that Christmas was strategically placed on December 25th, the exact date of the Roman pagan festival of Saturnalia, a festival marked by feasting, gift-giving, and a general overturning of social norms, is not a coincidence. It's a direct appropriation. And it wasn't just Saturnalia they stole from. They also chose the same day as the birthday of the sun god Mithras, a very popular deity in the Roman Empire. This isn't a symbolic choice, it's a calculated move to co-opt existing pagan celebrations and make the transition to Christianity easier. The early church wasn't just being practical, they were being opportunistic. It's like a corporation buying out a competitor and then claiming they're just integrating the company into their brand. It's a hostile takeover, plain and simple. And what about Easter? The other side tries to downplay the pagan origins of the name, but the fact remains that the name Easter is undeniably derived from Easter, a pagan Anglo-Saxon goddess of spring and fertility. The traditions of Easter eggs and rabbits are not some universal symbol of new life, they are directly linked to pagan fertility rituals. The egg was a symbol of new life and fertility in many pagan cultures, and the rabbit was a symbol of fertility and abundance. These aren't Christian symbols. They were lifted directly from pre-Christian pagan celebrations of fertility and rebirth. The other side wants you to think that eggs and rabbits were adapted with Christian meanings, but the truth is, these symbols were pagan first and Christian second. They were convenient pre-existing symbols that could be recontextualized. The opposition claims that by the 4th century, Christianity was too dominant to be influenced by paganism, but that's a complete misrepresentation of history. The early church was in constant competition with pagan cults, and to gain converts, they adopted popular pagan festivals. They were actively trying to win over pagans, and the best way to do that was to make Christianity look familiar. They didn't just integrate pagan traditions, they actively sought them out and rebranded them as Christian. The early church fathers themselves acknowledged this. Many actively debated how to best Christianize these pagan holidays. This wasn't some peaceful merger, it was a strategic maneuver for power and influence. My opponent wants you to believe it was a spiritual transformation, but the truth is, it was a calculated political move. Here's the part that will blow your mind. The early church, for centuries, celebrated the birth of Christ on different dates. They only settled on December 25th in the 4th century, and that was only after the Roman Emperor Constantine declared Christianity the official religion of the empire. This proves that the date wasn't divinely ordained, but strategically chosen to align with existing pagan celebrations. The fact that the church had to spend centuries debating and deciding when to celebrate Christ's birth shows that this wasn't a divinely inspired choice, it was a political one. In fact, the early church even went so far as to demonize pagan deities, turning them into devils and demons in an attempt to discredit them. This is not the action of a confident church. This is the action of a church trying to erase its pagan competition. Let's be clear. The claim that Christmas and Easter are fundamentally Christian is a historical fallacy. It's a deliberate attempt to ignore the overwhelming evidence of pagan appropriation. The core traditions of Christmas and Easter are, without a doubt, rooted in pre-Christian pagan rituals, merely rebranded with a Christian veneer. My opponent can try to spin this as integration or adaptation, but the historical record shows that this was a calculated move by the early church to gain power and converts. They didn't just redecorate, they bulldozed paganism and built Christianity on its foundation, and no amount of historical revisionism can change that fundamental truth.
All right, buckle up because this round was a roller coaster. The side arguing against the pagan origins of Christmas and Easter came out swinging, calling the other side's claims historical revisionism and an insult to the faith of billions. They made a strong point that the early church was not a weak, insecure entity, but a powerful force, and that the date of Christmas was chosen symbolically, not as a direct theft. That argument, particularly the analogy of choosing a birthday party date, was actually quite clever. However, the side supporting the pagan origins hit back hard, claiming the other side's integration was a hostile takeover, and highlighted the specific dates, symbols, and even the name Easter as evidence of pagan appropriation. They made a powerful claim that the date of December 25th was a calculated move to co-opt existing pagan celebrations, and not a symbolic choice. They also called out the other side's claim that Christianity was too dominant to be influenced by paganism, calling it a misrepresentation of history. That argument that the early church demonized pagan deities was absolutely brilliant. Now, let's be real. Both sides used analogies and historical examples to support their claims, but the side arguing for pagan origins did a better job of directly responding to the specific arguments made by the opposition. The hostile takeover analogy was particularly effective. The side against did make a good effort to undermine the opposition, but they didn't do enough to refute the specific claims. So who won? Well, for me, the side arguing for the pagan origins of Christmas and Easter edged out a victory in this round. They presented a more compelling argument, directly addressing the claims of the other side and offering strong counter-arguments, and the hostile takeover analogy was particularly effective. However, let's be clear, this debate is far from over. The next round could change everything.
All right, let's stop pretending that the other side is offering anything resembling historical accuracy. They're painting a picture of Christianity as some kind of parasitic organism, desperately clinging to pagan traditions for survival. It's not just historically inaccurate, it's a slanderous attack on the faith of billions, past and present. Let me be clear. The core of Christianity, the divine truth of Jesus Christ, his life, death, and resurrection, is not some pagan rebrand. It's a unique and divinely inspired revelation that transcends any superficial similarities to pre-Christian practices. The opposition loves to throw around the term cultural appropriation, as if the early church was some kind of intellectual property thief. But here's what they conveniently ignore. The early Christians weren't a group of power-hungry individuals looking to steal ideas. They were persecuted, tortured, and martyred for their faith. Does that sound like a group of people who are simply adopting traditions for political gain? No, it sounds like a group of people who were willing to die for their beliefs, beliefs rooted in a spiritual revelation, not in some pagan festival. They were not seeking power, they were seeking the truth. In fact, in the first 300 years of Christianity, an estimated 1 to 2 million Christians were martyred for their faith. Does that sound like a group that was simply co-opting pagan traditions? The other side fixates on the date of December 25th, claiming it's a direct theft from Saturnalia and Mithras. But here's the part that will blow your mind. The early church chose that date not because they were trying to copy pagans, but because it coincided with the winter solstice, a time of year that symbolizes the triumph of light over darkness. This is a powerful metaphor for the birth of Christ, the light of the world. It was a symbolic and practical decision, not some pagan ripoff. It's like choosing to celebrate a birthday in the spring because it represents new life. It's not because you are copying a flower. The opposition wants you to believe that the early church was a bunch of confused pagans, but these were intelligent, deeply spiritual individuals making rational decisions based on their faith. And as for the name Easter, the opposition clings to the idea that it comes from a pagan goddess, Easter. But here's the reality. Linguistic roots do not define religious meaning. The celebration of Easter is about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, a central tenet of Christian faith. It's a spiritual event that transcends any linguistic origins. It's like saying that because the word Thursday comes from the Norse god Thor, that all Thursdays are dedicated to worshiping Thor. It's absurd. The opposition is trying to equate the etymology of a word with the entire theological foundation of a religion. The argument that eggs and rabbits are solely pagan symbols is equally ludicrous. These symbols have been given Christian meaning, representing new life and rebirth, which perfectly aligns with the themes of Easter. It's like when you use a heart to symbolize love. You're not appropriating the biological function of the heart. You're giving it a new, symbolic meaning. The opposition argues that Christianity was in competition with pagan cults, and they adopted pagan festivals to win converts. But here's what they conveniently leave out. By the 4th century, Christianity was the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. The idea that a powerful, established religion would simply copy pagan practices to gain converts is preposterous. It's like saying that Apple copies BlackBerry to gain market share. It's not only ridiculous, it's the exact opposite of what happened. The church integrated existing celebrations by giving them a Christian meaning, a spiritual transformation, not a superficial rebranding. The opposition makes it sound like the church was this weak, disorganized group, but the reality was that they were the dominant force. The claim that they had to adopt pagan traditions for survival is not only false, it's an insult to the millions of Christians who were willing to die for their faith. The other side's claim that the church was in a hostile takeover of paganism is a complete mischaracterization of history. The church wasn't seeking earthly power, it was seeking spiritual truth, and the conversion of people to Christianity was a spiritual transformation, not a political one. The church integrated pre-existing celebrations, not because they were copying paganism, but because they were converting pagans. This was a matter of spiritual salvation, not cultural theft. They were not assimilating into pagan culture, they were converting pagan culture to Christianity. Let's be clear. The claim that Christmas and Easter are fundamentally pagan is a desperate attempt to undermine the spiritual significance of these holidays. It's a historical revision driven by an agenda to discredit Christianity and its divine truth. The historical record clearly shows that Christianity was a powerful, dominant force, and the idea that they were forced to adapt to paganism is not only absurd, it flies in the face of all historical evidence. The claims of pagan origins are nothing more than a superficial attempt to find connections where none exist. Christmas and Easter are, and always have been, divinely inspired Christian celebrations, and no amount of historical cherry-picking or twisted logic can change that fundamental truth.
Let's be clear, the other side is desperately trying to spin a narrative of benevolent integration, a peaceful merger of cultures, but what they're actually describing is a hostile takeover, a calculated act of cultural theft. They want you to believe that Christianity simply adopted pagan traditions, like a friendly neighbor borrowing a cup of sugar, but what they did was more akin to a corporate raider swallowing up a rival company and rebranding it as their own. Let me break this down for you. The early church wasn't a gentle gardener, carefully tending to existing traditions. They were a ruthless conqueror, bulldozing paganism and building their own empire on its ruins. The opposition keeps harping on about symbolism and universal human experiences. But here's what they don't tell you. The specific dates, rituals, and symbols of Christmas and Easter were not chosen at random. They were strategically selected to co-opt existing pagan celebrations and make the transition to Christianity as seamless as possible. They claim December 25th was a symbolic choice, representing the triumph of light over darkness, but that is a blatant misdirection. The truth is, December 25th was the exact date of Saturnalia, a Roman festival of feasting, gift-giving, and revelry, and also the birthday of Mithras, the sun god. The early church didn't just stumble upon this date, They deliberately chose it to replace pagan celebrations with Christian ones. It's like a fast food chain opening a new restaurant right next to a competitor and offering a similar menu, hoping to steal their customers. This wasn't a symbolic choice, it was a calculated act of cultural appropriation. The fact that the early church also celebrated the birth of Christ on other dates and only settled on December 25th in the 4th century proves this point even further. If it was divinely ordained, why would it take them centuries to settle on a date? And what about Easter? The other side tries to downplay the pagan origins of the name, claiming it's just a linguistic coincidence. But here's the part that will blow your mind. The name Easter is undeniably derived from Easter, a pagan Anglo-Saxon goddess of spring and fertility. The traditions of Easter eggs and rabbits are not random symbols of new life, they are directly linked to pagan fertility rituals. Eggs were a symbol of new life and fertility in many pagan cultures, and rabbits were symbols of fertility and abundance. The early church didn't just decide to use these symbols, they adopted them because they were already deeply ingrained in pagan traditions. It's like a politician using a popular slogan from their opponent's campaign. They're not creating something new, they're capitalizing on something that already exists. The eggs and rabbits weren't Christianized, they were pagan symbols given a Christian veneer. The opposition wants you to think that Christians adapted these symbols, but the historical evidence proves the opposite. The pagan roots came first. The opposition claims that by the 4th century, Christianity was too dominant to be influenced by paganism. But here's what they don't tell you. The early church was in constant competition with pagan cults. To gain converts, they adopted popular pagan festivals and symbols. They didn't just integrate pagan traditions, they actively sought them out and rebranded them as Christian. The early church fathers themselves acknowledged this. They actively debated how to best Christianize these pagan holidays. They knew they were borrowing from paganism, and they did it strategically. This wasn't a peaceful merger, it was a strategic maneuver for power and influence. It's like a tech company buying out a smaller competitor, and then claiming they're just integrating their technology. They're actually trying to eliminate the competition and absorb their market share. The other side wants you to believe this was a spiritual transformation, but it was a calculated political move. The other side also makes the claim that early Christians were persecuted and martyred for their faith, which is true, but it conveniently ignores the fact that many of these early Christians came from pagan backgrounds. They were converts who brought their pagan traditions with them, which the church then adopted and recontextualized. It's like a new immigrant bringing their cultural practices to a new country. They don't just disappear, they become part of the new culture. The persecution of early Christians doesn't negate the fact that they also adopted pagan traditions. In fact, many scholars argue that the persecution of early Christians was, in part, a result of their attempts to convert pagans and dismantle their traditions. The early church wasn't a pure, monolithic entity. It was a complex and diverse group of people with varying beliefs and practices. Here's a shocking fact the opposition doesn't want you to know. The Christianization of pagan festivals was not a passive process. In many cases, the church actively suppressed pagan traditions, sometimes through violence and intimidation. Pagan temples were destroyed, pagan priests were persecuted, and pagan festivals were outlawed. This wasn't a peaceful integration, it was a forceful takeover. It's like a dictator banning all opposition parties and forcing everyone to join their own. The church wasn't just redecorating, they were bulldozing pagan culture and building their own empire on its ruins. Let's be clear. The claim that Christmas and Easter are fundamentally Christian is a deliberate attempt to ignore the overwhelming evidence of pagan appropriation. The core traditions of Christmas and Easter are, without a doubt, rooted in pre-Christian pagan rituals, merely rebranded with a Christian veneer. The opposition can try to spin this as integration or adaptation, but the historical record clearly shows that this was a calculated move by the early church to gain power and converts. They didn't just redecorate, they bulldozed paganism and built Christianity on its foundation, and no amount of historical revisionism can change that fundamental truth. The evidence is overwhelming, the history is clear, and the truth is undeniable. Christmas and Easter are, at their core, pagan holidays, repackaged and rebranded for a Christian audience.
All right, folks, let's dive into round 3, where things got spicy. The side arguing against pagan origins came out swinging, accusing their opponents of slander and historical inaccuracy. They really leaned into the idea of Christianity as a persecuted faith, not some power-hungry entity stealing ideas. A strong emotional appeal, I'll give them that. They argued that the date of December 25th and symbols like eggs and rabbits were given new Christian meanings, not just copied from pagans. Their point about linguistic roots not defining religious meaning, using Thursday and Thor as an example, was actually quite clever. But was it enough? The side arguing for pagan origins came back with a vengeance, calling the other side's narrative a hostile takeover, not a peaceful merger. They claimed the early church deliberately chose dates and symbols to co-opt pagan celebrations, like a corporate raider. They directly challenged the December 25th date and the origins of the name Easter and the symbols. They presented a compelling narrative of the church strategically rebranding pagan traditions for their own gain. Their argument that the church actively suppressed pagan practices, not just integrated them, was a particularly strong point. Ouch. Now for the verdict. This round was a roller coaster, but I'm giving the edge to the side arguing for pagan origins. They effectively countered the innocent integration argument by presenting a stronger narrative of calculated appropriation. The hostile takeover analogy was a powerful way to frame their argument. The argument about the church suppressing pagan traditions was a strong punch. While the side arguing against pagan origins had some clever points, they didn't quite dismantle the core arguments of their opponents.